It's the technology that promised to bring us together, to keep us connected to old friends and find new ones, to make it easier to share ideas and be heard. But as we know, all too often, social media is anything but social, filled with scams and misinformation, bigotry and hate. The problem isn't going to go away, so we need to become better consumers of social media. I'm Herb Weisbaum, the Consumer Man, a contributing editor at checkbook.org.
Welcome to Consumerpedia at checkbook.org. We're the nonprofit that helps consumers select services, avoid trouble, and save money. Because we don't accept any advertising or take money from any business we recommend, you can rely on checkbook.org to be completely independent and objective. Now, here's the host of Consumerpedia, America's consumer expert, the Consumer Man, Herb Weisbaum.
Something a little bit different in this episode. We're talking about social media. About 7 in 10 adults in this country used a social media site last year. That's according to a survey by the Pew Research Center. That figure has remained relatively stable over the past 5 years, despite the controversy and the negative feelings many people have about social media. Emmy Award-winning sportscaster and journalist Bob Costas has a lot to say about social media, which is why I asked him to share his thoughts with us. Bob is a good friend. We went to Syracuse University together. We both worked at the college radio station, WAER, and were roommates at Del Plain Hall. Bob is joining us from the Big Apple, New York City today. Hiya, Bob.
Hey, Herb, how are you?
Very well, thank you. So you're a nationally known sportscaster who covered the Olympics, who's on CNN and HBO, and does play-by-play for Major League Baseball, and you're not on social media. That might surprise a lot of people. Why not? What's the matter with you?
I don't think there's anything the matter with me. I'm not criticizing people, at least not in general, for having social media accounts. There's just no upside for me. I address very large audiences. I certainly don't need to offer my every random thought beyond that on Twitter. I'm not looking to share my life on Instagram or Facebook. Anybody who I want to send photos or a link to or something that relates to our friendship or to our family, I know how to reach those people. I don't need to open up any more portals. And I don't think that my every random thought or my every relatively mundane but perhaps of interest to my friends and family, but beyond that, not to the larger public, that every bit of that needs to be shared with anyone else. I don't criticize, however, someone who's looking to build a career or has a good reason to put information out there that's part of their business. I don't criticize that at all, as long as they do it in a reasonable way and it's not something that's disproportionate to whatever else should be part of their life.
You're often mentioned, for good or for bad, in social media posts. Do you ever look at that stuff? Does that ever impact you at all? Are you curious what people are saying about the sportscasting or the commentary you make?
What I'm more likely to see, because so much is on the internet, there might be a news item that appears in the Houston Chronicle or something, which I might not otherwise have seen, and I see that. And sometimes I'll take a look at the comments, which occasionally are insightful, and certainly you appreciate it when they say nice things about you, but there's also a lot of wacky stuff out there. Like, there have always been dopes and nitwits floating around, but now they all have a voice. So at the beginning of social media, or when established news outlets, newspapers and whatnot, took their material digital, the first thought was, well, okay, it just is available to more people, and perhaps they can post things that supplement what is found in the primary publication. Sounds like a good thing. Sure. Well, those publications always had letters to the editor, but the key word was editor. If a column prompted 100 letters, let's say, and 90 of them were in agreement with the columnist and 10 were not, and they only had room to print 10 letters in the paper itself, then a good editor would select 9 that were representative of whatever point of view and 1 that was in dissent. But he wouldn't just open the paper up and let anybody throw anything on there that they wanted to. But with rare exceptions, that's what happens in comment sections now, where every nitwit and knave can say anything they want. Now, there's a difference between a difference of opinion, an informed difference of opinion, and just ad hominem nonsense, or things which people can say that aren't even pertaining to the subject. Just some sort of sideswipe they take at a person, including, I met so-and-so in Wichita, Kansas in 1983, and the person's never set foot in Wichita, Kansas. So the mainstream publications which have gone digital have not always applied their own standards. I think the technology is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it. If it was good and it came off Gutenberg's printing press, it was good. But if it was a lie and somebody carved it on the wall of a cave with a jagged rock, it's still a lie. So the technology now has outrun the basic principles that used to guide us in media and in mainstream media for all of its flaws. There were guardrails and checkpoints and expectations and certain levels of credibility, even if we didn't always reach our best ideals. At least those guidelines were there. Now, more often than not, it seems to me, it's just a free-for-all.
You've been a part of the discussion about social media responsibility because of the highly publicized case of Nets All-Star guard Kyrie Irving, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But a little bit more about the big picture. Do you see any positive impact from social media, or is it most negative? Another Pew survey here that was done in the summer of 2020 showed that about 2/3 of Americans, 64%, said social media have a mostly negative effect on the way things are going in this country. They're concerned about misinformation, hate, and harassment, as well as inciting polarization and creating echo chambers where people just hear what they want to hear, which is the big concern I have.
That's right. Well, all those things are true, but if you're asking me for a positive, let's say that you have a community of people, someone has a particular disease or affliction or a particular concern, and they're able to have a community online to talk about those things. Or a family, their friends start a GoFundMe account when some difficulty befalls a family. That's a good thing. Or you hear about someone who otherwise might not get noticed, but someone puts it on Instagram or Facebook, and it's worthy of notice and worthy of appreciation, and it gets out there. But it's mixed in with all the negatives that you just mentioned, Herb, and those negatives are significant. They've already had an obvious poisonous effect on the body politic. When you hear somebody say, I did my own research, you know what that almost always means? I disregarded everything that's out there from credible sources until I found something in my voluminous research on the internet that affirmed what I already believed or wanted to believe. I've concluded my research. I found something that will affirm what I believed in the first place.
You're absolutely right. And I've had discussions with some younger people, but older folks as well, who when the whole vaccine situation was coming about, and I was trying to give them factual information about the COVID vaccine, and they would say to me, well, I did my own research. What'd you do? I went on Facebook. Facebook is not a news source. Facebook it's a utility like the electricity or the water. It just comes through the pipeline. Nobody's checking it out for accuracy.
Of course. And again, we need to stipulate what now is called the mainstream media was never perfect because it's a human enterprise. Are additional voices a good thing? Yeah. The mainstream media was never liberal enough for people at The Nation magazine. It was never conservative enough for those at National Review. But when I read The Nation or National Review, I realized that it was coming from a left-wing or a right-wing perspective, but I didn't think they were lying to me. I didn't think it was misinformation. When I read the Wall Street Journal now, whether or not I am a right-winger, it's an interesting, mostly conservative perspective, but it's a credible perspective. If I read the Washington Post, they actually have a variety of columnists, including conservative or moderate columnists, but generally speaking, its editorial page leans left. I understand that, but it's a credible publication, as is the Wall Street Journal. I cannot say the same for much of what we see and hear on cable television, and I certainly cannot say the same for much of what we read online. And that's why one of the most important things that can be taught in schools, as soon as kids are old enough to digest this material, is media literacy. Not teaching them what to think, not indoctrinating them on what to think, but helping them navigate through this morass of information to identify what are credible sources and what's worthy of their attention.
And one more point, Bob, when you go to the sources you were talking about, if you go to a reputable publication, a Wall Street Journal, a New York Times, a Washington Post, whatever, you know you're dealing with that publication. If you go online, and I'm just making this up, get information from the Center for Vaccine Responsibility,
right?
That could be the Chinese, that could be the Russians, it could be anybody hiding behind that nameplate on social media.
Sure it could. And once the internet and the various outlets, YouTube is an example, which is wonderful. You know, if you just want to watch old I Love Lucy's or whatever it might be, or you didn't catch the game last night and there's probably condensed highlight package that's right there, it's wonderful. And obviously, you can use the internet to find out information at a moment's notice. That's all great. But eventually, the algorithms intuit what it is you want to hear, and they feed that to you constantly. which just reinforces that whole bubble that many people are living in. Now, my feed, it's not unique, but it's probably rare, because I get stuff coming from all different directions because I'm interested in stuff coming from all different directions. Mm-hmm. And I didn't start doing this until I was in middle age. So I already had a certain grasp of the world around me and a certain ability to discern what was worth my attention and what was credible and what was not. But if you're now, 14, 15, 16 years old, and this stuff is coming at you like a tsunami, how are you supposed to differentiate? It's a real problem.
When we come back, we're going to talk to Bob Costas about a story he's covered extensively, the Kyrie Irving story, and why we should care about what star athletes share on social media. This is Consumerpedia, powered by Checkbook.org.
Checkbook.org can save you money on all sorts of services you need and help you find high-quality businesses in your area. From tax preparers and auto mechanics to electricians and plumbers, we have ratings in these 7 metro areas: Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. To find out more, visit checkbook.org. Our advice is always free. Ratings of local services are available with a subscription. If you live in one of these 7 areas and haven't joined Checkbook yet, check us out. Get a free 30-day subscription by going to checkbook.org/Consumerpedia.
Okay, let's talk sports with legendary sportscaster Bob Costas. And of course, we're going to talk about Kyrie Irving. For those who are not familiar with the story, in October, Irving posted a link on Twitter to an anti-Semitic film. After being called out for doing that, he declined for a week to apologize or say that he held no anti-Semitic beliefs. As a result, the Nets suspended him, Nike suspended his deal with Irving, stopped the launch of his latest model of his shoe line, so this did cost him a significant amount of money. Irving eventually took remedial action required by the league and is playing with the Nets again. Bob, this is so much more than a sports story. Tell me how you see it.
Well, without delving into all the aspects of Kyrie and the response to it, and whether or not the Nets' response and what they demanded of him before he could be reinstated was appropriate or excessive, there's a lot of overlapping issues here. But it starts with what the topic here is with our discussion, which is social media. I spoke with Doc Rivers, the longtime NBA player and coach, recently, and he said one of the big differences in coaching now is that you have a whole generation of players who have grown up with social media and to whom it is second nature to post almost anything, their own feelings, links to things, whatever it might be. But Kyrie Irving has nearly 5 million followers on Twitter, I guess is where he posted it. And it's unlikely that he watched the entire 3.5-hour film. He just had a certain notion about it. But by putting it out there, implicitly, whether he acknowledges this or not, he's implicitly encouraging people to watch it. That seems like something of an endorsement. He has to be careful, A, because of the content of it. Is that something worthy of putting your imprimatur on? That's one thing. But B, it starts a whole firestorm around him, around his team, around the league. There have always been people that were more or less informed, more or less measured in what they did, but they didn't have this tool, which can be used and misused, at their ready disposal. There was always a guy at the end of the bar muttering nonsense, and other people generally moved away from him. But now that nonsense can get out there widely. And if that person is well known for other reasons, quite apart from their expertise on whatever the subject at hand might be, if they're known and even celebrated for other reasons, and then they share their every random and it's sometimes ill-considered thought or recommendation, well, that has an influence well beyond what it used to have when people just used to spout off.
Bob, on your HBO show, Back on the Record, one of your roundtable panelists, Mamani Jones, said Irving probably didn't even watch the movie and had no idea what he was sharing and didn't include a caption or comment with his post on Twitter or Instagram. What do you make of that? What's your take on that?
My guess is he probably didn't. I felt that I had to before conducting this conversation on my program, so I slogged through the whole 3.5 hours of it. And to distill it to the part that's pertinent here, it cites a supposed quote by Adolf Hitler as credible concerning, and I'm just quoting here, the nature of Jews in America. It quotes Henry Ford, who obviously is a significant figure in American history because of the motor vehicle industry, but was well known as an anti-Semite in his time. It lists 5 falsehoods which Jewish people in America profit from. One is the Holocaust itself, casting doubt either upon the Holocaust ever happening or the seriousness of the Holocaust and the widely accepted figure of 6 million Jews perishing in the Holocaust. That's all you need to know. That's in less than 3 minutes. It doesn't make any difference if anything else in the 3.5 hours is in any sense credible or interesting. That's in there. That's toxic. That's awful. That should be rejected out of hand by anybody, no matter their background. So, Kyrie puts it out there. Maybe he didn't realize that, or if he did realize it, he didn't realize the severity of it. But that goes to Doc Rivers' point, that it's harder and harder to coach a team when you don't know when a firestorm will start. Usually it doesn't have to do with larger issues like this. It might just be that somebody puts out, why am I not playing more? I don't like this guy or that guy, or I have a beef with the coach. Certain things don't need to be shared with the world, and the upside of doing it is so much smaller than the potential downside. We hear all the time of well-known people getting into trouble in one way or another because of what they posted on Twitter. How are their lives enhanced by that? The risk-reward element here seems to be out of whack.
So even if Kyrie didn't watch this 2018 movie, Hebrew to Negroes, Wake Up Black America, but just decided to share the link because he found out about it, does that, so to speak, get him off the hook for sharing it? Is that okay then?
It's not okay. It puts it in a different light. But he could have cleared that up, and he didn't. He could have said, look, perhaps I should have watched it all the way through. I wasn't fully aware of the content. I disavow any hateful content that is in it. I apologize and I take responsibility for it. If he had done that, he would have nipped it in the bud, but he didn't. In fact, his initial response for the better part of a week was defiant, and that made a bad situation worse. Now, maybe the Nets were heavy-handed in laying out like a half dozen different steps he had to go through, which led some people to think that they weren't just looking for contrition, they were looking to humiliate him in some way. And without getting too deep into this, Kyrie, who's a terrific player, has a history of being problematic with each team he's been on. I said this on the air, whether people agreed with his point or agreed with the point and disagreed with his means, speaking of Colin Kaepernick had a point. I'm not sure what Kyrie Irving's point has ever been. He was a flat earther, declared that the earth was flat. He was an anti-vaxxer, and because of that, he had to miss all of the Nets' home games last year. Now there's always something, and that becomes problematic for his team no matter how good a player he may be. You're paying the guy $35-40 million a year, and it's always something. So that may have led to the Nets coming down harder on him than they would have if there wasn't a past history. But still, what he did in posting this link is objectionable, and he should have disavowed it. We can debate whether or not the suspension and the terms of reinstatement were proportionate or not. But the idea that there was an initial offense that was worthy of action, I think that's beyond dispute.
Bob, you mentioned Coach Doc Rivers a couple of times, the coach of the Philadelphia 76ers, my team. I'm from Philly. Great show, by the way. And his position basically was boiled down to, if you are a celebrity and you share something on your social media feed, you are endorsing it, and you better know what you're sharing, and you should look at it first and know what you're sending out. Would you agree with that?
It's completely reasonable. Yeah, that should not be a controversial statement. Doc's got it exactly right. You got to own what you put out there. And I didn't know what it was is not a good enough excuse. If you don't know what it is, then don't bother to post it.
Social media is not going away, so we have to deal with it. How do we do that? How do we become more discerning consumers of what shows up on our feeds and what we share with other people? We're going to talk to Bob about that next. This is Consumerpedia, powered by checkbook.org.
Consumerpedia Fast Facts. The first tweet was sent in March of 2006 by Twitter's former CEO, Jack Dorsey. It said, "Just set up my Twitter." Facebook remains the king of social media platforms, with more than 2.9 billion users around the world. YouTube is a close second, followed by WhatsApp, Instagram, and WeChat. More than 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. Fraudsters are also on social media. According to the Federal Trade Commission, 25% of all fraud losses reported last year resulted from scams that started on social media.
We're back with Bob Costas, legendary sportscaster and good friend, talking about social media. Bob, I want to start this section by reading you something. This is from Donald Morrison, a columnist and co-chairman of the advisory board at the Berkshire Eagle, a daily newspaper published in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And here's what he wrote recently about social media. He shares a story of a British anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, who suggested there's a limit to the number of friends a human can handle. Anything bigger than 150 is just too hard for us to keep track of, he says. Social media, however, Morrison writes, allows us to have an almost unlimited number of friends. Of course, they're not really our friends. We don't so much interact with them as serve them up along with our friends to be merchandised and manipulated by the platforms. Social media engineers have learned to keep us hooked by playing on our emotions, especially anger and moral outrage, Morrison writes. Another addicting technique, he reminds us, is the skillful deployment of metrics, the dopamine hit of views, likes, and follower numbers dangled before us like daily report cards. Thus, online discourse has acquired the characteristics of a video game with batting averages and body counts. I assume you would agree with that.
Yeah, and he said it much better than I have been able to. There are all kinds of instances and academic studies now about the effect it has, especially on adolescents. You know, adolescents are subject to insecurities and growing pains, emotionally, physically, whatever it might be. And if you're gauging your self-worth based on how many likes you get, or worse yet, if you're looking at stuff online, and adolescence, as we know, can be mean, and hateful stuff is being said about you, hurtful stuff that plays right into the insecurities that young people have. There are instances of people committing suicide because of that, or having, short of suicide, deep psychological trauma because of that. There were always people who said lousy things about their classmates in the hallway or passed hurtful notes, because that's part of human nature, especially at that stage of life. But it didn't have these sorts of platforms. It didn't have something that in theory stays out there, even after the person at whom it's aimed and the person who hurled the insult has grown out of it. It still exists in some sense. And it's very difficult for someone who's 15, 16 years old to have any kind of perspective on that. So we know that that happens. But also, to the writer's point, you could have kind of figured this out for yourself just by common sense, but there are academic studies now, which he alluded to, that confirm this, that if the content is filled with anger or resentment or recriminations, it's much more likely to get hits, and it leads you to something else which is connected to it, and you become further hooked on it. That's much more likely to score points in terms of clicks than something that's more moderate and reasonable. If the headline is, Herb Weisbaum blasts Seattle mayor, even if you had offered a very nuanced take, rips, blasts, clobbers, whatever it is, that's going to get many more clicks than if the headline was, Herb Weisbaum offers insight into mayoral race. Not going to get nearly as many clicks. And I will tell you from personal experience, I've always tried to be as accommodating as I can to requests. I know how I would have felt when I was young, and if I had asked Mel Allen or Red Barber for a moment of their time and they had accommodated me, that would have made me feel great. So I've tried to be as accommodating as possible. You know, and even now you get a call from some kid in Albuquerque. He's producing a radio show. His dad went to Syracuse with us. Of course I'll do it. But up until recently, if you did that, the audience for that was whoever was listening in Albuquerque. Or you talk to someone from the Berkshire Eagle, the audience was the readership of the Berkshire Eagle. Now it's not just a possibility, it's a certainty, especially if your name has any sort of resonance, that what you say will be repurposed without much regard for context or nuance. And the only thing they'll care about is the clicks attached to it. So it's almost inevitable that what you say will be in some sense misrepresented. What you also see now, and it's so lazy, and it's such an affront to journalism, and it's not just done by somebody at some website where there are no guardrails, there are no editors, there are no principles of credibility or journalism. Those sites have sprung up like weeds. They exist. But there are also the digital platforms of established, supposedly credible publications, but they operate with a different mission statement than the newspaper or magazine itself. And very often what they will do is that they'll take a flurry of things that show up on Twitter and treat it as if it's a pew poll, as if it's something you should pay attention to because it's a reflection of larger public opinion, where it might just be a half dozen people venting on Twitter. And all this lazy supposed journalist has to do is write a few semi-functional sentences to frame it, and here it is. And it's presented as if it's a story. Well, that's, at best, a distortion of the truth, and at worst, it's an assault on the truth. And that's a problem, too.
Yeah. So getting back to something you said earlier, and I think we'll close with this, to me, that is why in schools, they need to teach kids social media literacy, how to survive in this digital world that's coming at them 24/7 and deal with all this stuff. So they don't get depressed, they don't get filled with hate, so they don't get trapped in this bubble of bouncing around in an echo chamber.
Yeah, that's very important for especially young people, as you said, in that social media aspect. But then beyond that, in what passes for journalism or news, everybody, no matter what stage of life they're at, has to have a handle on how to navigate through this morass of material, an increasing percentage of which not only is not credible, it's toxic.
So the takeaway here is pretty clear. Think before you tweet. Think before you share. And don't assume it's the truth just because it appears on social media. You know, we could probably talk about this for hours, but Bob, I know you're really busy, so we're going to let you go. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Herb. Happy holidays.
Well, that's it for this episode of Consumerpedia. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. That way, you won't miss an episode. Remember, we release new ones every other Thursday. Another way you can support this show is to follow us on Consumerpedia on Facebook and Instagram, and at My Consumerpedia on Twitter. I'm Herb Weisbaum. Thanks for listening.
Consumerpedia is a public service of checkbook.org. We're a unique nonprofit that empowers you, the consumer, to save money and make smarter choices. From auto repair shops to doctors, plumbers to vets, you can count on checkbook.org to help you find the best services and avoid the worst. Local ratings are unbiased and accurate. If you live in or around these 7 cities and haven't joined Checkbook yet, check us out. Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. To get your free 30-day subscription, go to checkbook.org/Consumerpedia. Consumerpedia, empowering consumers to save money and make smarter choices.